Alright. So we talked about emotions in the first half of class, and that gave us an idea of some very specific feelings that people might display. But when we talk about emotions, a lot of researchers believe that that particular definition, that particular thing that we can look at, is a little too specific. Instead, what some researchers have started to do is kind of transition from looking at emotions to instead looking at almost personality types that people have and ways that people tend to display emotions out through, I guess, a number of exposures and consistently over time. And when we look at that consistency with an emotion, well, what we typically talk about isn't emotional standards, but instead something called temperaments. So a person's behavioral style and tendency of displaying specific emotions. And when we study temperament, what we see, just like we saw with emotional control in Walter Mischel's study with his delayed gratification children, is that there's a huge variety of temperaments within children. So when studying early children, not only can they control their emotions differently, but their overall emotional trends, which emotions they tend to display more often, varies dramatically from child to child. Some children are called easy children, and these are children that have very positive reactions to most things, and also ones that tend to adapt very set routines to make life a little bit easier for them. But if they encounter new experiences, encounter challenges, they don't tend to be as flustered by them as some other children. Another group of children that have a different temperament are called difficult children, and these children have the exact opposite reactions to things as easy children. So instead of reacting positively to new things and kind of the mundane things, they tend to react negatively to almost everything. And when we look at their behavioral patterns, we see that most of them don't like to adapt routines. They don't like to kind of create systems that make life easier. And instead, they're just kind of moving moment by moment. And a lot of times, when something new comes up, it takes them a while to kind of change their behaviors, to kind of adapt to whatever they're encountering. A third type of child, one that's kind of different from difficult children, even though there's still a lot of negativity in their behavior, is something called a slow to warm up child. And this temperament's hallmarked by very low levels of activity, no matter what's going on. So if something new happens, they don't really change their behavior. If something consistent's happening, they don't really change their behavior. And it's not that they change the behavior in a positive or negative light, even if they do. It's just kind of an alteration of things. And when they do behave any way towards something, when they do react to anything, it's a slightly negative reaction to things, almost as if they're kind of feeling like they're compelled to do something even though they don't want to. We call this type of a child a slow to warm up child. The last type of child is something that really is kind of a cop out. We call unidentified or undefined children. And these are children that don't really fit into any of the categories consistently. So sometimes they might be an easy child, sometimes they might be a difficult child, or sometimes they might be slow to warm up, while other times they might be difficult. These undefined children don't happen that often, but sometimes we see kids that experience very specific social encounters, in particular traumatic encounters, might kind of have this mix of different temperaments based on the surrounding environment. But usually when we look at children and their emotions, we see is that most kids kind of fit into one of three categories: easy, difficult, or slow to warm up. And this encapsulates their emotional trends, their emotional tendencies. And we think that a lot of these differences probably are both biological and social based. When we look further at this idea of temperament, what we can often see is that their overall temperament can have an impact on a number of aspects of their life. One of the things that can impact is the way they deal with other individuals, or their extroversion-like behavior. If you have a very positive child, what you'll typically see is a child that has a lot of good interactions, kind of reacts to things in a very good light, and typically seeks out other individuals. Now, if you have a child that's very low on this, they do the exact opposite. They tend to avoid people. They don't like anything that they're experiencing, and that causes a lot of negative emotions when they encounter anything that they're not accustomed to. We also have something called a negative or positive affectivity, where children are either very or they're very, I guess, inclined for negative responses and stress to new things, or they're very inclined for positive responses to stress and new things. The last thing that we see, the last kind of thing that we can see these temperaments affecting, is self-regulation. So the ability to really recognize their own emotions and to recognize their behaviors that relate to emotions. And we kind of mentioned earlier that self-regulation relates to individual differences within children, but it also relates to individuals within temperaments as well. Now, why temperament in childhood is so important to a lot of researchers, because when we look at a number of studies, what we often see is that childhood temperament very, very often carries over into adulthood temperament. In fact, that delay of gratification study that we talked about earlier, the ability to resist those marshmallows, is something that Michel used as just merely an example of differences between children. At least he used this originally as a means of showing differences between children. But what was surprising to Michel and other researchers was that when he followed up on these individuals, when he looked at these children 20, 30 years after they were done, not only did these children display differences then, but these differences they displayed back when they were 3, 4, 5 years old had a huge predictive value on their behaviors as adults in their 20s and 30s. What he saw was that these kids that were capable of resisting that marshmallow tended to be much happier, and tended to go through many more years of schooling, tended to make more money, tended to have fewer levels of divorce rates, tended to be described as much more easygoing by their peers, and a whole bunch of other positive things related to emotions that we might think of were usually used to describe individuals that were able to resist those marshmallows. And the ones that weren't, well, displayed emotional behaviors that were on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. So when we look at these early behaviors, when we look at these early indicators of temperament and the way that people can react to things, it's not only important to understand them for how they impact children, but it's also important to understand them for how they impact us in the long run. Now you might be asking yourself, when looking at these different temperament styles, where do they come from? Well, we've already suggested that our environment, our social world, can definitely impact our temperament. But a number of studies have also shown that our biology, our basic chemistry, can also be linked to our temperament. One classic thing that we've seen in a number of temperament studies is that the temperament that we have can very, very often be linked to the temperament of our parents. And in fact, in heritability studies that look at siblings, identical twins, and twins with only a small amount of overlap with each other, or fraternal twins, is that temperament is something that very, very often can be linked to genes. So the closer your genes are to somebody else, the more likely that you're going to have the exact same temperament as that individual. So even though we'd like to think that temperament is something that we can control and we can influence in children, when we look at sibling studies, we see that some of us might just be pre-programmed to have specific types of temperament. What we also see in studies on biology is that not only are we probably pre-programmed to have temperament, but even if we try to overcome that, our brain is acting against us. If we look at the brain activity of an easy child when they're exposed to a very stressful situation, one thing we see, which is very interesting, is the area associated with emotion that we've talked about earlier, the amygdala, doesn't react that much when these easy children are exposed to stressful situations or to new novel stimuli. When we look at the amygdala of another child that's a difficult child, we see something very different. That amygdala becomes very, very active and over-responds to most situations to the point where you know, when looking at amygdala activity, that this child is probably experiencing a lot of emotions. So not only does heritability and genes kind of give us a proclivity to experience specific emotions, but even if we know that we don't want to display emotions, our brain seems to be overreacting or underreacting in a way that kind of instigates us to experience the emotions that we have that relate to temperament. That being said, our brain and our genes don't seem to be the only thing that influence our temperament. One thing that we see in a number of studies is that the activity levels of children when they're young tends to predict the activity levels of these same people when they become adults. And your activity levels very, very often are linked to your temperament at a young age and an older age. So the more active you are, the more you do, the better your chances are of having a better temperament. The less you act, the less you do things, the more likely you are to have a difficult temperament or a slow to warm up temperament. And these studies that have looked at activity levels and temperament have shown a very strong link between these two particular concepts. We also saw in the very beginning of the class that emotional levels, the way people control their emotions and react to things, can be strongly linked to cultures. And if you're in a culture that supports kind of a lack of an emotional response to things, so in East Asian cultures, crying is very, very rare, and showing displays of happiness is almost equally rare. Those cultural impacts can have a dramatic impact on how much our temperament changes. And these cultural and social things seem to be very good predictors of temperament, in fact ones that are just as good as biology when we look for the cause of people's overall emotional behaviors. What we also see is that when somebody has a specific temperament that they're kind of inclined to, the fit that a child has with their parents or the primary caregiver, tends to impact how those temperaments play out over the long run. So if you've got a child that's very slow to warm up and a parent that's very aggressive to that child and pushes that child, very often those children can become either slow to warm up as adults or difficult as adults. But if you've got a child that's slow to warm up, a lot of times if they encounter a parent that's very positive and kind of nurturing of this need to warm up and to kind of get used to a situation, those children can sometimes develop into more high efficiency children, or ones that we would consider normal in temperament. And that change, that growth, and the kind of pairing of good parenting and good education has been something that a lot of developmental psychologists have stressed when we find children that are either difficult or slow to warm up in our studies. When we look closer at this concept of temperament, what we also can see is that temperament can be impacted by some very basic cognitive processes and very basic behavioral processes that we sometimes take for granted. One of the cognitive processes that's been very strongly linked to temperament is something called social referencing. And this actually deals with the concept of theory of mind that we talked about earlier in cognitive development. With theory of mind, we recognize that children have the ability to understand the thoughts of others. With social referencing, we argue that children have the ability to actually pick up on the emotions of others and the emotional cues that others are giving off. Well, in temperament studies, what we found is that the specific temperament a child displays can often be linked to their social referencing skills. The more positive the temperament of a child is, the more capable or adept they typically are in their social referencing skills. As a child becomes more and more difficult, the fewer social referencing skills they typically tend to display. And those difficult children not only display fewer social referencing skills, but the way they interact with people also tends to change as they age. And this interaction change that we see is oftentimes called attachment styles. In social psychology and in developmental psychology, when we look at this concept of temperament, we often pair it with the concept of attachment, because a lot of times we believe that temperament is very strongly linked with the way we interact with people in the long run. And what a number of studies have shown is that our interaction with individuals can both be impacted by temperament, and it can also impact the temperament levels that we often display. And what a number of studies have shown is that our attachment, our need for attachment, is something that seems to be innate within all of us. And if these needs aren't met, a lot of behavioral changes and a lot of emotional changes can often be paired with this lack of having our attachment needs met. What I'd like you to do is actually watch a video that's looked at the necessity for attachment and how it might affect behavior in this YouTube video that's linked here. So I'd like you to take a few minutes so you can see a video on Harry Harlow's work on physical comfort, attachment, and how that might impact temperament over the long run. Now, Harry Harlow's work on attachment, which you saw in that video, relates to how these young monkeys actually interacted with the researchers and within the cage. But what we see in other research on attachment is that not only can that impact kind of immediate behavior, but it can change our overall pattern of behavior that's very similar to the temperament styles that we talked about earlier. In general, what it can do is it can change the way we interact with other individuals overall. One researcher named Mary Ainsworth set out to try to understand how temperament and attachment can actually change the way we interact with individuals. And what Ainsworth did was set up a situation that she called the strange situation, where children would be presented with a number of kind of changes within the environment, stressful situations, that would allow researchers to look at the way that the child interact with their primary caregiver and with strangers. And what Ainsworth found in her study was that not only did these children probably display different temperaments, but the way they attached to people, the way they behaved around their primary caregiver, was dramatically different from child to child. And what she argued after looking at these children's behavior was that not only do we have different temperament styles, but we also tend to have different attachment styles as we age and as we progress. What I thought we could do here is have you guys watch a video that kind of summarizes Ainsworth's video, and then we'll talk about the 3 different types, or actually 4 different types, of attachment styles that Ainsworth looked at in the study, or found in her particular study. So please, once again, go to that YouTube link, watch it, and then come back and we'll go over the different attachment styles that Ainsworth really stipulated in her study. For those of you that saw that video, what you probably saw was an example of a securely attached child. It's one that has a very close attachment to the primary caregiver, and one that displays a lot of stress and anxiety when the caregiver leaves. Essentially, Ainsworth argued that this is the exact type of attachment that we want to see in children. We want to see them taking comfort from somebody around them, and we want to see them having a source of attachment that allows them to encounter new things, new challenges. But Ainsworth argued that this particular type of attachment only happened in about 50 to 60% of the children that she tested. Other children displayed other attachment styles that caused a lot of problems in their social life as they aged. One type of attachment style that she described was something called an insecure avoidant attachment, where children had a very weak attachment to their mother or primary caregiver, and really didn't care whether or not their mother and primary caregiver was there, or whether or not anybody was really there when they were in that particular situation. Another type of attachment style that Ainsworth argued existed was something called an insecure resistant attachment. And this was hallmarked by a very close relationship with the mother or primary caregiver, but a lot of anxiety and frustration and almost anger. It was also paired when anything unusual or anything stressful tended to emerge. And that anxiety and that stress that kind of emerged when things became difficult made it very difficult, according to Ainsworth, for these children to explore new things, to encounter new things, and because of that, it had a big impact on their temperament. A final type of behavior that Ainsworth kind of stipulated in her later research of something called insecure disorganized, where children really had no ability to react to anything in a normal way. So they were scared when their mother was there, they were scared when their mother was gone. All of these behaviors of fear were very indicative of kind of that slow to warm up temperament. And really, Ainsworth believed that this kind of insecure, disorganized attachment style kind of triggered the slow to warm up temperament, and it also kind of related to it as well. Now, since Ainsworth's studies and looking at kind of where these attachment styles came from, what she's concluded is that not only do we have these differences, but we can typically link them to the way parents interact with their children, and we can link them to our adult behaviors. Surprisingly, when we've tried to replicate Ainsworth's studies, when we've tried to look at adults, what we've seen is varied results in kind of this transition from childhood attachment styles into adulthood attachment styles. We believe that attachment styles do relate to temperament. There's very little doubt within the social world that there is a link between those two things. But when we look at aging, what we often see is that these attachment styles, these basic performances, tend to change as we age. When we look at adolescence, what we see is that these basic attachment types, these connections that people have, start to transition. So the objects, first of all, of attachment go from the primary caregiver to friends or girlfriends and boyfriends. And this transition tends to cause other attachment styles to emerge. So we do have the securely attached people again. We call them secure or autonomous. And we've got dismissive avoidant attachment styles, which are very similar to those insecure avoidant attachment styles, where there's always anxiety when anything new happens. But we've got some other ones that seem to emerge when we get into adolescence, and it kind of indicates that there's not that one-to-one carryover from childhood into adulthood. One of the first new ones that we see in adolescence is something called preoccupied ambivalent attachment, where these individuals seem to always want people around them, but when people get around them, they tend to want to fight with them and cause conflict within that group. Another type of attachment style that tends to emerge in adolescence is called unresolved or disorganized attachment, where really adolescents kind of seek out the attention and the closeness with others all the time, not because they enjoy other people's company, but they're scared of being alone. They're scared of being abandoned by people around them. And this unresolved, disorganized attachment style didn't seem to really emerge in young infants. When we look at these attachment styles, when we look at these specific adolescent attachment styles, what we see is that these particular behaviors tend to carry over a little bit more into adulthood, and they also tend to predict a lot of health-related behaviors at this age. So when we see an unresolved, disorganized child, or I guess an unresolved, disorganized teen, what we often see is those individuals are much more often linked to sexual activity, early sexual activity, and drug use than the secure, autonomous individuals. And we also see that the dismissing avoidant types tend to also be much more inclined to drug use and other types of kind of stimulation approaching behaviors. So when we look at kind of the long-term effects of attachment, we see that some of Ainsworth's early attachment styles do tend to emerge in adolescence, but they kind of morph and they move to other areas, and these other areas start to kind of transition to other aspects of our lives. When we get into adulthood, we see even more transitions. Now, these transitions aren't nearly as dramatic as the ones from childhood to adolescence, but what we see is that we get more of a narrowing down of attachment styles when we become adults. We're either secure, anxious, or avoidant most of the time. At least that's how psychologists define their attachment types. Securely attached people want to be close to people, are comfortable being close to individuals. Anxious types don't want to be left alone, but also don't want to be close to individuals as well. And avoidant types really don't want anything to do with anybody and don't want to be around somebody where they're overly exposed. And what we see in these particular behaviors is that these three types emerge in adulthood, and a lot of times these three types of individuals tend to describe their upbringings as very similar to these attachment types. But when we look at their behaviors, when we look at their patterns, there's not a very high correlation between these attachment types and the attachment types of infants, children, and even oftentimes adolescents. In fact, most of the time when we see these three types, the biggest predictors of attachment types in adulthood is the prevalence of traumatic experiences during adolescence or even during early adulthood, and the emergence of social factors and kind of interactions with friends and dating partners that really kind of shapes the attachment types that we display. However, even though there isn't that consistency from childhood into adulthood, when a person starts to display a specific attachment style, very often that attachment style that emerges in early adulthood tends to carry over for the rest of that individual's life. So if you're secure as a young adult, typically you're secure in late adulthood. If you're anxious as a young adult, typically you're anxious into late adulthood in your later years. And that transition, that kind of change from being fluctuating all over the place to being more consistent, is what we typically see in developmental psychology. But this concept of attachment, unlike some of the concepts of temperament, seems to be one that there is a lot of fluctuation in as we progress throughout our life, even though we very often we pair attachment to this concept of temperament. That's pretty much it for the concept of emotional developments. Just to review, when we look at the concept of emotions, temperament, and attachment styles, we see a lot of evolution throughout our entire lives, but we also see a lot of growth and complexity, and we also see consistency within a lot of these areas as we age. Another big thing, another theme that we had from today's class that I want you guys to remember is that when we look at these three factors, we see that social events or environment play a major role in our development of emotional skills, our development of temperament, and our development of attachment styles. But in addition to the social factors that play a role in these things, our biology, our genes, tend to play another major role in how these things actually develop. And when we look at how these things impact our life, we can see a number of avenues of our life that these things change. So we can see our health-related behaviors being impacted, we can see our social world being impacted by the way our temperament and our emotions emerge. And a lot of times we can see the end-life product, so who we're close to, who we hang out with, being very closely linked to this type of social emotional growth. In the next class, we're going to kind of move on from this concept of emotional development and look instead at personality and identity development, so who we think we are and what our consistent traits actually are. Make sure, before you get to that next class, that you've read Chapter 11 from the text, and if you can, take some notes on that, and be prepared for all the information that we're going to be going over. It'll make the slides much more easier to get through next week. Make sure you also turn in that weekly write-up. If you have any questions, as usual, email me. That's it for this week. I hope you got something out of this, and I'm going to see you all next week. Thank you.